I'm sure you are enjoying the sumptuous lunch. But what I want to tell you is that you are going to enjoy this next 25 minutes on redefining Mavericks from one of the best Maverick of Dr. K.M.Cherian I have come across in my life. So, extraordinarily gifted individual, extremely distinguished. In Indian subcontinent after K.M.Cherian, I have to define somebody, it has to be Dr. K.K. Over 250 indexed publications in most of the leading journals of the world. His contributions have been many, like to define chief, it also takes quite a bit of time for me to define Dr. Krishna Kumar. But what is interesting is that an icon being spoken about, being discussed about by another icon from India will be a very, very interesting, insightful lecture from him, and let's look forward to hear Dr. Krishna Kumar. Thank you.
Thank you. It's been a wonderful evening, and I think it's going to be hard for all of you to listen to a very long talk right after this. I do hope I can engage your attention. I should start by thanking Sandhya and all of you and Dr. Cherian for enabling this opportunity. And this is very special from a very personal perspective. Can you connect the slides? Yeah. This talk is unique because it's different, and I have never worked with Dr. Cherian. I have had numerous opportunities where I could have worked with Dr. Cherian, but I actually never did. And I'm also not a surgeon. Nonetheless, I'm truly honored and privileged to have actually selected for this position. My background, I'm from All India Institute. My mentor, Dr. Tandon, who shares many attributes with Dr. Tandon, with Dr. Cherian. I was in All India Institute. I did adult cardiology. In a way, in a sense, I'm a bit of a maverick because I moved away and decided to do pediatric cardiology. I trained in Boston Children's Hospital. And then, while I was in Boston, I was told about Dr. Cherian. I got in touch. I came to Escorts because that's where I got a job, but I wasn't happy. I asked Dr. Cherian to give me a job, but he had committed to Dr. Prof.Krishna Kumar. He said, I can't, I've promised her and I don't have a position for you. Our paths sort of crossed in a way, but I ended up in Amrita. And I ended up in Amrita and I had these three individuals who bored me with daily anecdotes of Dr. Cherian. Nothing would be, every day there would be some reference to him. I said, what's this? Why did you leave him then? I mean, you're so much in admiration and awe of this man. They said, well, we had to be independent. Dr. Haridas was the one who engineered my coming to Amrita Institute of Medical Sciences. But I'll tell you why I'm really passionate about. And of course, Shiva, he came in a year later and said, listen, we used to keep saying, you should have been working with Dr. Cherian, we would have loved working with you, and you guys would have struck such a fantastic relationship. It's so sad that you actually never worked with him. I said, what's going on? And anyways, more time happened. Actually, this operation means a lot to me. This talk, I know that not many people are in a position to even listen right now because it's a little late. But from a personal perspective, it means so much to me because the one thing I'm passionate about, the one lesson I learned in Boston is that pediatric cardiac care is teamwork. So I became really obsessed with the idea of teamwork, and I helped build, along with Suresh and Shiva, a remarkable team of individuals where we try to deliver superb outcomes. Build a team unless you understand the psyche of the people who are actually doing the work that you're doing. The world's hardest job is pediatric cardiac surgery. Nothing tests a human being more than it. Because it combines so many attributes, and so many attributes that are opposite to each other. It needs finesse, it needs speed. It needs courage, it needs patience. It needs judgment, it needs decisiveness. So it needs everything, that kind of opposite attributes that need to come together at the same time, at the right time, And then you have to be innovative, you have to be enterprising, you have to have the ability to get along with the team members, you should be curious, desirous of lifetime learning, etc., etc., etc. So it's remarkable. And trying to understand the surgeon was one of the most important aspects of trying to create a cohesive team effort that I did, and I was fortunate enough to. The trouble is it's very frustrating, because whatever the surgeon does is dependent on what he can do, but also on what others do. And despite the best of efforts, the surgeons can lose a child, not because of his or her fault. So there are variables completely beyond their control. And this is something I learned. And this is true for me also. I mean, there is only so much that we can do. And the whole team members, we realize there's so much of uncertainty despite all the effort. And that's what defines the Maverick. Because we decided, knowing this uncertainty, knowing the difficulties, we're going to do what we have to do, which is driven by passion and not caring about the consequences. It's all about swimming upstream. And Maverick, being a Maverick, is all about swimming upstream. Now you take Dr. KMC's life and you realize that there is every attribute of the Maverick that he kind of fulfills. So, you have these really crazy terms like heretic, dissident, but I think most importantly, he was not a conformist. The opposites define the real meaning. So if you look at his career graph, and it's kind of similar to what we have, except that he took it to another level altogether. So he had the option. Back in the 50s, he could have, I think the majority, 90% of his classmates would have just settled for practice. He chose to do post-graduation. And during post-graduation, he decided to pursue cardiac surgery in the first year itself. He chose not to do practice. Instead, he went overseas for training. Overseas life was great, but he decided not to stay in Australia and came back to India. He was in India, became successful, became famous, but did not rest on his laurels, decided to build his institution. Of course, this is an extremely abbreviated version of his whole story. But you look back, and those years in Manipal, I don't know, Dr. KMC, if this is an accurate portrayal of what Manipal was in the late 50s. But what was important was this man, Dr. Ullal, who inspired him to become a great surgeon. And I think it's fantastic to hear that story. It's very inspiring to listen to that. But what's remarkable is that Dr. Cherian's passion for cardiac surgery was consuming him in the first year of his surgical training, that he had to actually spend nights in the dissection hall to learn general surgery. And now that kind of defines who he was. So driven. And then, of course, he had the option of either working at Kattanam in the mission hospital at a nice salary of 5,000 a month those years with housing and other benefits. He just rejected that and went to CMC, which was an academic institution which was starting to do open heart surgeries at a much lower salary in terrible living conditions. Terrible living conditions. He came to Australia, he became a superstar. And you've seen those photos of the Ford Capri. But what I'm going to tell you is really interesting is this association with Victor Chang. And they were called the Aurora Brothers because the train that plied between Sydney and Melbourne was known as the Southern Aurora Express. It was so quick, and when the two of them got together, it was magic. Now, he had a superstar status in a racist society. Can you imagine the stardom? But he decided no, he wants to learn pediatric cardiac surgery, infant heart surgery in New Zealand, and went to Barrett Boys, learned that. He came back to Australia, but did not stay in Australia, came to Railway Hospital. Now, I know a thing or two about railway hospitals because I grew up in the whole railway colony. My dad was in the railways. I know all about it. I heard about Perambur. And I know about the grades, about the hierarchy. So he started off as an assistant medical officer. His salary was 1,000 rupees, a little over 1,000 rupees. The only privilege that position gave him was that he was an independent cardiac surgeon. But it was terrible. I mean, if you talk to any railway man, they'll say this guy is crazy to have actually started off as an AMO after all these years of training. AMO is absolutely in the lowest rung of the ladder. Again, bad housing. And it's a very interesting story how he got promoted to a DMO. I won't say that, it's just too much of information here, but really just shows you the drive to do what he wanted to do against all odds. So 3 very interesting quotes from Perambur, of course. I got this from a website called Madras Musings, and it talks about the passion and the joy of doing cardiac surgery in a very challenging environment. Creating, using a bucket to calibrate a heart-lung machine. And then running from his residential quarters to a ICU in Lungis to see the patient. So he didn't care. I mean, this is the ultimate sign of a maverick. It didn't matter how others perceived of him. He just wanted to be there on time. I think 9 out of 10 of us, or majority of us, would change before you go and see a patient. He wouldn't. Now that's something which it just struck me. Okay, he was doing well in railways, he could have stayed there. He wanted to learn infant heart surgery, pediatric heart surgery the right way. He wanted to acquire academic foundations. So he was selected to go and work with Dr. Kirkland. Did not go to Dr. Kirkland straight away. Decided to first learn pathology with Dr. Lev at Deborah Heart Institute. Dr. Kirkland was wondering where he was. Then went to learn, do a year's fellowship with Dr. Kirkland. Okay. This was at a time when, actually the option could have been he could have done adult heart surgery and just been very famous, but he chose to do infant heart surgery because no one doing it. The challenge excited him. When he came back, he was in railway hospital. He could have joined a corporate hospital. He could have joined private practice. He could have made tons of money. He said, no, I'm going to build my institutions. And then, of course, one after the other, he built institutions. So he fulfills the Maverick checklist big time. So he's innovative, independent, goal-focused, risk-taking, broke all rules, open to experience. So that's another beautiful thing. It's the fact that you love the experience, you learn from the experience rather than trying to, find other ways to learn. And then willing to stand the ground when they know that it's true within their gut. Moving forward regardless of criticism, not worrying about consequences, highly creative in what they do, and never give up. And all these attributes have been pointed out some way or the other. But he never abandoned core values. I think the work ethic, that's something that Shiva kept talking about. Dr. Suresh always mentioned. It's the extraordinary work ethic that he imbibed, that he instilled onto his trainees. His respect for teachers and mentors, his investment in surgical skills, his love for academic foundations, although he didn't have the conventional kind of training that we all have had. And I think that's been to his advantage. His compassion and this fantastic story that I managed to read in his book about Aisha, the Muslim girl, for whom he donated his first salary for her to be able to buy medications, and that saved her life. And then, of course, the teams that he built. So these are his mentors that I managed to collect from reading about him, and each of these stories are remarkable. For lack of time, I'm not going to go into the depths. They've all been referred to, but famous amongst them are Tim Cartman, Sir Brian, and then of course Rowan Nix, Al Pacifico, Dr. Kauchikos, and Albert Starr. So I actually remember this quote from Confucius. I think Dr. Cherian embodies this quote, which is, I hear and I forget, I see and I remember, I do and I understand. So Dr. Cherian actually approached his learning by doing. That's my guess. I don't know if I'm right or wrong, but most of us who are conventionally trained, we go through these steps of trying to read, trying to go through the conventions, but Dr. Cherian would just dive right into every problem. And I think that's what made him different. And that's the learning from doing, which is very, very important, that is happening less and less these days. So the legacy is remarkable. And this is words that I have penned myself. I think his legacy is in the spirit and the passion that he transmitted across generations, which I feel, I can even now gauge amongst his trainees. And the lives of patients that he touched, of course, that's there, 46,000 of them, the surgeons that he trained, and not just the surgeons. He has actually touched so many other professionals who've been influenced and inspired by him. And these are these pictures of some of whom are in the Mavericks group, and you've all seen them. There's many of whom are in this room, in this space right now. And this is the list that we are seeing. But what's interesting, is that a teacher affects eternity. And Dr. Cherian doesn't know where his influence ends. I'll tell you where his influence is running today. And that's in Amrita Institute. Where you see Dr. Suresh and Dr. Shiva came in. They trained two others, Dr. Sunil and Dr. Sajan and Dr. Baiju and Dr. Girish, all four of them doing fantastic work and leading their own centers. They then trained others, Dr. Ashish, Dr. Dhiren Dave, Dr. Thomas Matthew, and we are currently in Amrita with the third generation of trainees from that legacy. And that generation, which includes Balaji, who's in this room, who's also been trained a bit by Dr. Cherian, but that generation is producing remarkable outcomes, which I'm really proud of. I'm so proud of this team, but that I owe. So just final thoughts. Why is it so important to talk about a Maverick? I mean, we are here to celebrate his birthday, of course, that's true. We are celebrating his birthday. But why is it that we have to nurture Mavericks? We have to nurture them. We can't all be Mavericks, but we can't just all be conformists. We can't all be herded like sheep. We need somebody to think differently. If all of us become herded like sheep, we are not going to have any new ideas coming in. We are not going to have any new developments happen. And we are all going to be ordinary. And that's increasingly happening. Today, we are faced with a crisis. Medicine, engineering, all disciplines in India are done and taught in such a way that we somehow take away the curiosity, the ability to think independently, and we produce people who are very much structured into a certain way of thinking. Because our system is not encouraging this kind of independent thinking. We desperately need people like Dr. Cherian to show the way. His life is something that should be used as an example of what it takes to succeed. If we all continue to follow the conforming confines of our education today, I think we may lose out on giants like him. So this is what we have to think about, especially with these entrance exams and these kind of very constraining ways in which we are training the next generation. We are losing the opportunity to create the giants whose shoulders we've been walking on. Thank you.